Today in the EU, in conversation with Emily O'Reilly. No matter who the candidate the parliament elects today will be, taking office after EU ethics watchdog Emily O'Reilly will not be an easy task. The Irish author and former journalist made history as the first female ombudsman and spent 11 years expanding the office's investigative powers. But how does she look back at her mandate? I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today, I'm joined in the studio by outgoing Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly. I wanted to start with an assessment of your mandate. You've been Ombudsman for the past 11 years, and your role is now coming to an end. How do you feel about it?
Mixed emotions. Sad to be leaving. It's been a fantastic 11 years, very privileged. And I'm very happy with what I and my colleagues have achieved during that time. But happiness that I'm not going to take part in another election with the European Parliament. So it's always quite a stressful thing, especially when you're not a politician.
And I'm curious about the intentions that you carried with you as you first took office. What were they?
When I came in, I wanted to make the office a lot more useful. So I used visibility, impact and relevance. I just wanted to strategically manage the office in a way that we were much more useful, both to the institutions, but particularly to the citizens of the EU.
And looking back, do you think that's what happened?
I think we've become a much more influential office in the life of the European administration. And I think one of the key things I did at the beginning was to use the power of own initiative investigation that was in the office and was subsequently strengthened in the new statute that came in a couple of years ago. And that meant that we could deal with issues that citizens may not necessarily have been aware of, but were judged to be of significant public interest. So we could look at issues that even if we hadn't got a direct complaint about it, that we could investigate it if we felt that we could add something useful to it. And the Frontex investigation, which I think we're going to talk about, was one of those. That was an initiative investigation, and we've done many. Of course, the core of our work remains the individual complaints. So when I look at the range of issues that we've been involved in, everything from financial services, fundamental rights, revolving doors, integrity, I think our work has brought value to the EU. I don't want to overstate what our role is, but I think certainly in terms of what this tiny little office does, less than 80 people, I think we have punched above our weight.
And among the many institutions and agencies you've looked into, Frontex has been a central one, especially as of late. In the past 4 to 5 years, the number of inquiries your office has addressed towards Frontex has increased quite significantly. Why is that the case?
Well, I think you had the big, it was termed the migrant crisis in 2015, 2016. Obviously, it also became a huge political issue, but a huge, more importantly, humanitarian issue in relation to the number of people who were fleeing, whether it's wars or poverty or persecution from various countries. And obviously, Frontex as well was changing. It was becoming a much bigger organization, much better resourced and so on, more powerful. And it was obvious then the combination of the humanitarian crisis vis-a-vis people who were trying to come to Europe and the increasing power of Frontex. I think it was inevitable that we were going to get more complaints in relation to that.
In terms of the nature of the inquiries that you've done, it seems that quite a big percentage revolves around disclosing documents that should be of public interest and therefore public access, but yet somehow they're not.
In the last 11 years, we've had a lot of success. Over 80% of the recommendations and suggestions that we made are accepted by the institutions. But where we get pushback is in relation to access to documents. And it is a matter of a huge frustration to the office, but more particularly of huge frustration to citizens, NGOs and parliamentarians who are trying to get information. And it seems to me that at times, be it the Commission or other agencies, it's as if sometimes Regulation 1049, which is the regulation that governs access to documents, doesn't exist. And decisions are made for political reasons or reasons that have to do with the interests of the institution and not always with the interests of the citizens who have a fundamental right to access those documents, with its certain constraints and so on. And so what that leads to is either refusals for reasons which we don't find credible or huge delays when the information is no longer as useful as it might have been. I mean, it became so serious that I made one of only two special reports to Parliament, which I did earlier this year in relation to the delays at review stage. So those tend to be the ones that are most sensitive. And we found in, I think it was only 80% of cases that there were delays. They went beyond on the time limits. Now, we got unanimous support from the Parliament in relation to that. Every single person who voted in favour of the report that was done and the recommendations contained therein. But whether it's cultural or political or a mixture of both, there are barriers to the proper dealing with Regulation 1049, and that remains problematic.
There's one big occasion in which you tried to get more transparency following the shipwreck of the Adriana vessel in Greece in June 2023.
It's been 1 week since an overloaded fishing trawler filled with hundreds of migrants sank off the southwest coast of Greece.
Rescue vessels carrying survivors to the Greek port of Kalamata arrived throughout the day. Local media is reporting most of the migrants were young men from Egypt, Syria, and Pakistan trying to get from Libya to Italy.
Beside this punctual event, what prompted the investigation?
Well, in relation to the Adriana, over 600 people drowned. We don't have an accurate figure. I don't even think all the bodies have been recovered. And I remember both professionally as an ombudsman, but also personally being a mother, my mind went to those moments when all of those bodies were in the sea. And the fear, or the terror, the panic must have been horrendous. It happened in plain sight. The Greek Coast Guard knew about it. The Italian Coast Guard was aware of it. Frontex was aware of it. There were various NGOs who were aware of it. And despite all of that, this didn't happen in 5 minutes. This took place the capsizing happened very quickly, obviously.
Here's Greece's Pakistani community president, Giada Santana, at a protest in Athens last May, recalling the testimony of a survivor who puts the blame on the Coast Guards for this disaster.
But the lead up to it happened over many, many hours. So when it happened, obviously there was a great outpouring of, it's terrible and we need to find the facts. This is being said by the Commission. But there's no one body that can find the facts. And then when nothing was happening at EU level, I thought, well, let's look at Frontex. We don't have a mandate over Greece, but we do have a mandate over Frontex. So I think I wanted to have answered, insofar as we could, a very simple question. How did that happen?
And did you get any answers?
What we eventually found was that there is a gap between Frontex powers and member state powers. And it was really that gap that enabled, to a certain degree, the Adriana tragedy to happen, because we discovered that Frontex could only act when they were allowed to act. They did not have autonomy. Once the Greek Coast Guard became the coordinating body, then everybody had to go by their orders. So on 4 occasions, Frontex attempted to contact the Greek authorities, the Greek Coast Guard, and say, can we come over? Can we help? Will we do this? Will we do that? The Greeks simply never answered. They never replied. So when eventually Frontex did come back to the site, the boat had just sunk, and the Greek Coast Guard said, we don't need you anymore.
Through your conversations with Frontex, did you have a sense of why a Mayday wasn't issued? When looking at the footage, that really looks like a state of emergency.
Things that were known. Okay, so the Frontex plane flew over and videoed for 10 minutes. It was also getting information from the Greek authorities, from the Italian authorities, and NGOs were also feeding in because they were reportedly in touch with people who were actually on the boat. So Frontex videoed, and they reported back that it was heavily overcrowded.
And do you know how many people were on board?
I think it was built for roughly 400 people, and there were over 700 people on board. And there were many people on the decks. And from what they could see, they were not wearing, life vests or anything that could protect them if they fell into the sea and couldn't swim, whatever. Separately, they would have known how long the boat had been travelling, so that would also give them information in relation to what the condition of the boat was likely to be, given that it was an old vessel. There were also reports from NGOs, civil society, that people wanted help, that there were reportedly dead people on board, that there were children on board. So Frontex did not issue a Mayday signal. The reason given was that at the point at which they were videoing the boat, they were not in immediate danger. What is immediate danger? I mean, to my mind, as a citizen, that's danger. Immediate, no, but what do you think is likely to happen? But technically, they were correct. They were not in immediate danger. And if they were the parameters they were using, then they were within those parameters. I think as well, I mean, that Mr. Leichen subsequently said that he would not necessarily have made a different decision. But that is the one power that Frontex did have to make a Mayday signal. So one of the recommendations that we made, or suggestions that we made, was to look at the system of Mayday signals. I think what we were essentially going to say to them, would you perhaps broaden the definition, because there are so many issues that apply, specific issues that apply to, let's call them migrant boats, or boats carrying people in distress, that do not apply to normal traffic. So the reply that we got from them, from my reading of it, didn't change anything in terms of the criteria through which they issued. I mean, they didn't actually have criteria. I think they have developed criteria now. It's all still a little bit opaque. But from my reading of it, it still is immediate danger that would prompt a Mayday call, and not a grouping of other issues, the ones like those that I have described, that would prompt it. But I think that needs some reflection, really.
Among the recommendations that you've issued, one was an encouragement to reassess their relationship that Frontex has with member states that prove they have a track record of not respecting human rights, basically to look into them and decide whether to cut ties.
One power that the executive director has is that he, and it is a he at the moment, can invoke Article 46 of the Frontex regulation. Whereas if he judges that is a level of fundamental rights abuse, shall we say, he can make the decision that Frontex will not cooperate with that particular member state. It is up to him to make that decision. Now, it would not be appropriate for me to say you should make that decision in relation to Greece, or indeed any other country. But what we did say was, if you decide that you're not going to exercise or trigger Article 46, explain why. Explain why. That's part of the accountability piece. As I'm sure many people would have thought, well, maybe in relation to this incident or that incident, you should. Now, as I understand it, a working group is now working on that. And we'll see what happens. And what they decide, or what the executive director decides. But citizens of Europe need to hear the reasons, because all of this is being done in their name.
When my colleague Magnus spoke to Frontex, they said it was essential to be in contact with neighboring member states, including Libya, Greece, and Italy. They did not mention Article 46.
It's a very difficult decision for anybody to make. And obviously, we have a particular political context at the moment, which would perhaps make it even more difficult. I mean, obviously the whole migrant issue has been instrumentalized, and it's easy for me to say you should do this, that, or the other. I mean, it's an incredibly complex, politically but also ethically, issue to deal with, and that's where leadership comes in.
On this, the political center seems to be tilting towards the right across the union. There is a rise in ethnic nationalism. Are you leaving this office worried about the future?
We're all worried about the future.
Yeah, I for sure am.
Yeah. Well, things go in cycles, I mean, I was always struck by the fact that almost exactly 10 years before the Adriana tragedy, we had the Lampedusa tragedy, if you recall, when a boat actually had caught fire. A lot of people died. And a lot of them were buried on Lampedusa, or there were ceremonies for them. And it was a very emotional time. And I think it was Barroso, who was the Commission President at the time, he went to Lampedusa, and he was very moved by what happened. And it was, never again and all of that. And so there was a very humane response to it. And then politics happened. You realize as ombudsman that sometimes you're only as effective in a way as the system and the culture allows you to be. If you're working in a culture in which there's a very positive, warm embrace of migrants and everybody's fine and all of that, then something like that happens and everybody's going to get terribly angry and things will be fixed. If you're not, then they won't be, or they won't be for a while. But I take the view that it is the responsibility of this office to point out what institutions, agencies and bodies are obliged to do under the law, under the treaties, under the various conventions of human rights to which we're aligned to. And then it's up to them to choose whether to do it or not. But I cannot look at the politics and say, oh, well, gosh, a bit tricky now, so I won't do that. I won't say this, and I understand, and it's difficult. I always remember when I was running for Ombudsman back in 2013, I think in 2012, the EU had won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And over, around the Esplanade, just in front of the Parliament building, there were all these wonderful pictures of the trajectory of the EU from Auschwitz to the Nobel Prize, And Europe brands itself very strongly on its fundamental rights, values and so on, and correctly so. I mean, compared to a lot of the rest of the world, we're pretty good. But the branding has to be matched by the actions. And, I remember I was before a group of politicians from some member state and various groupings within the member state. And I was talking about Frontex, and one person got quite angry. And I said, well, what's the EU expected to do? So let them drown? So whatever they choose to do in relation to border controls, in relation to the control of migration more generally, though, fine. But when something like the Adriana happens, at the very least, there has to be accountability. And yes, the people who put those people on that boat in obvious danger, of course, they carry huge responsibility. But we are the EU. We won the Nobel Prize for Peace. We have to set different, and we do, higher standards for ourselves, and we have to live by them. At the very least, we need to know what happened, who is accountable, and what's going to happen in future.
And ultimately, to trace accountability, you recommended the creation of an independent committee to assess the large number of deaths in the Mediterranean. Are there any developments on that front?
Well, what's happening? I mean, we did say a commission of inquiry. I think ultimately it'll be our report. The commission did respond to us. Could I say it was a very humane response? They still asked us to keep it confidential for the moment until they engage with the member states. We didn't set a deadline for the council to respond, so we are writing to them basically what we were saying. Look, there's a gap between the EU's claim that, as Madame von der Leyen said, we have to save lives at sea, and that which would enable that to happen. There's a gap there, so it's over to you legislators to do something to fill that gap if you so choose. So it's down to them, but what I do want is a response. So if the council says, dear Ombudsman, we're not doing anything, lob the council, that's fine. But they have to respond. They have a duty to respond. And it's not to me, it's to the citizens of the entire EU. Mm-hmm. And it's also in recognition and with respect to those people who drowned and their families.
Thank you. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spreading the word about our work. Sound engineering by Miriam Sanz de Tejada. Research and production by Charles Cohen. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, your activist part of the Trust Project.